Okay, everyone. This is Tripp, Cassidy, Luke, Sam, and Sarah. We're going to be talking over a particular tweet thread by Rebecca McLaughlin on singleness and the church. So before we get started, maybe let's go around the circle and just talk a little bit about ourselves and our backgrounds related to this topic. And I'll say my age too. I think that's at least kind of important. So Tripp, 35, live in Seattle. I have a wife. We've been married for 10 and a half years now. And I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. Background is, pretty kind of conservative, reformed. Grew up in North Carolina originally. Now I live in Seattle. Let's go around the table. Cassidy, you want to go next?
Sure. So my name's Cassidy. I am from Phoenix, Arizona. I grew up kind of non-denominational Christian / evangelical, now sort of exploring orthodoxy. I'm 27 and I work in filmmaking and comedy. I'm single. I was engaged several years ago, but ended up breaking that. But single kind of since then.
Gotcha. All right, Sarah?
Okay.
You don't have to say your age if you don't want to. I didn't want to force that on you.
I was going to say, I guess I'm probably the oldest one here. I think I'm a little older than Luke. It's okay. I'm 37. I'm all right with it. Well, I've been married for soon to be 13 years. And we have an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, 2.5-year-old, and then one due in about 4 weeks. So we have our hands full. I was, my background is kind of non-denominational evangelical. Cassidy, we probably have some similar overlap there. The majority of my married life, I've been raising kids and homeschooling. I've worked off and on. I had a professional photography business that kind of has been flexible and has come and gone over the years. But that's about it.
Cool. All right, Sam?
Hi, I'm Sam. I live in the Chicago area. I am 31, and I've been married for I'm almost coming up on my 5th anniversary with my wife. We have one daughter who's 1 and change, and then we have another one on the way, so that's exciting. I work in kind of data analytics. I feel like I have like the most typical Chicago suburban dad life now, and it's kind of funny. I live in the suburbs. Before the virus, I took the train downtown to work in the office. My wife stays at home with our daughter, and so we have a super kind of, we could be in the 1950s for all we know. And church-wise, I grew up in sort of a heterodox, charismatic-ish Bible church thing. And so that's sort of my religious background.
Gotcha. All right, Luke?
Hi, I'm Luke. I'm 37, and I live in Minneapolis. I've been married for coming up on 15 years in not very long, about a month. Less than a month. What is it? Oh, it's a month exactly, isn't it? No, less than a month. No one cares. And let's see, background. Before that I was single, so I have some single experience.
Yeah, me too.
You weren't born married? That's crazy.
No, I wasn't.
So unchristian.
Let's see, upbringing. I call myself, most of my life, was kind of an evangelical mutt. And then when I got married, so most of my adult life, and I would say kind of after college, when my brain turned on, I think, I would say I was more in the young, restless, and reform movement. So the short version of what that is they're reformed in certain doctrines, not classically reformed, but they're charismatic, Pentecostal people would think, but they'd call it continuationist, whatever. And Baptist.
And they're antsy.
So
yeah,
I was in that.
You're antsy.
That's
You're
like
restless.
Huh?
You're antsy. You're restless. You don't.
Universalists? No.
No,
they were
well,
definitely not
the
that.
restless. I never understood what restless had to do. Anyway, sorry, that was a bad joke.
I can't hear. Is that my headphones? Okay.
I can hear.
Hello,
Good.
check, Luke.
Well, I missed all your funny jokes.
Not really.
Okay. And that's my background, yeah.
Cool. And have kids?
Oh, 3 kids. They are 12, 10, and 8. So
Cool.
they are, I think, becoming hormonal.
12 sounds about right, yeah.
Yeah. They, well, and it's not, yeah. It's, all my kids, I don't know, in a big 5 thing, they're all very high energy, very extroverted, slightly volatile. So they're just, can be a lot of fun, can be not as fun. So.
Right. Okay. So, like I said, there's a tweet by or tweet thread by Rebecca McLaughlin. She was responding to an article in Relevant magazine that was entitled "Why Are So Many Single Women Leaving the Church?" And so she has this tweet thread that kind of sparked this. So I wanted to read that, and then maybe just high level impressions from us would be good for setting this out. Like, what is your immediate, like, kind of gut reaction to this? Do you think it's mostly right, mostly wrong, or kind of in between? But let me read it first. She starts out and says, "It is vital that we stop presenting marriage as the telos for Christian women. In God's providence, there have always been more Christian women than men. So faithfulness for many Christian women will mean faithful singleness, but this is not a tragedy. A good marriage is a wonderful thing, but the New Testament makes clear that it is not better than gospel-hearted singleness, quite the reverse." And she quotes 1 Corinthians 7. "And yet so often we raise little girls to think that marriage plus kids is their telos, and we let single adult women be marginalized. Culture isn't just what we say explicitly, is often in and what's left unsaid. But I find myself telling my daughters again and again that I will be equally proud of them whether or not they get married, whether or not have the kids, etc. What matters is that they're in Christ. In a wider culture that idolizes sex, the counterculture of the church must not just be to limit sex to marriage, it must also be to embrace biblical community ethics and live as if we truly believe that marriage is, at its best, only a pointer to Christ, and family means all of us. This will take all of our combined efforts. It means all of us stretching to embrace those in different life situations. It means including single parents as well as singles without children, and including older single people as well as younger single people. It means single people reaching out to married people and married people reaching out to single people, and all of us recognize that we are a one body together and that we are all needed and wanted and loved. We need to field the whole team, and that's going to take some culture change. Here's what I think has happened. Churches have felt the need to defend marriage in a broader society that devalues it. Christians are attacked for believing sex belongs only in faithful heterosexual marriage, so we become defensive. But while we are right to champion marriage above any other forms of sexual relationship, from promiscuity on the one hand to long-term cohabitation on the other, we are not right to champion marriage above faithful singleness. The Apostle Paul would not be impressed." So that was the tweet thread. So why don't we go around and just gut reaction. What do you think? I can choose someone. Sam.
Gut reaction. I know where she's coming from. And I can understand the impetus for this. I feel like she gets a lot of things right, but there are some notes that she hits that I'm not quite sure I agree with, and I'm interested to hammer this out.
Okay, Cassidy.
Gut reaction, I think a lot of what she says resonated with me and I see as true. And I think I feel that, especially being a single woman who is not looking to make marriage my number one priority. But through the discussions and thinking about it, I definitely think that I can understand some people's points against it and think that there's a balance. but gut reaction, a lot of it was, I felt true and resonated with.
Okay, Sarah.
It sounds very personal to me, and that's where this discussion can get really complicated, because it all depends on your own experience, I think. Even though I was raised in a Bible Belt, evangelical, even, the Josh Harris streams of thinking, I never felt that pressure. And I was never it was always, yes, it was held up as something that was a very good thing and something to be pursued. But also, I think Cassidy, I think you were talking in the thread at one point about just feeling that pressure, even though it was someone who maybe was not the best for you. And, I didn't have that experience. And I also experienced a church and a family, like my extended family was we had a single guy live with us for 10 years in our guest house. And so and he will never get married. He had struggled with, and I say struggled because it was not something he wanted to embrace, but a same-sex attraction. And he was, he still is a part of our family. So I've seen that side of it more so than feeling the pressure to get married, even though I was definitely raised feeling like it was a very good thing, and I still do. And I think it's probably the norm. I think lifelong singleness is an exception. But yeah, her tweet feels very personal. So I'd like to know what her personal experience is with it.
I'll go into that a little bit. Luke, go.
Yeah, I think what Sarah said is spot on, and what all you said and what Cassie said, because it does feel very personal. In my experience, like I was saying, most of my adult conscious experience in church was after I was married. So I don't know. I had interesting experiences in church in regard to marriage and singleness that we can talk about as we go through this. But it seems like I think it's a difference between the idea of having marriage as a telos, like that is the norm, versus the culture, certain kinds of culture that can coalesce around that, which I think has nothing to do with marriage being the telos. It has more to do around weird church culture. So.
Yeah, my gut reaction was, I've known especially kind of middle-aged and older women, like kind of the mid-30s to like 50 range, in the church that are single, kind of frustratedly single, like like you could tell that this wasn't like, they weren't the kind of person that thought they wouldn't get married. And for whatever reason, it just didn't work out for them. And so like I've known those women, and I've also I know how frustrated that they kind of, have been kind of up and down and experiencing that. And I also have seen how the church doesn't do a really good job of providing a way for those women to like really pitch in and serve heavier than maybe like normal people can. Because if you have kids and you're married and that kind of stuff, you have limited time. And so I do think that it's true that maybe the church hasn't done a great job at providing ministry opportunities and really focusing in on those people that are, for whatever reason, going to be single. I think that she theologically gets some stuff really wrong in this. And that's one of the reasons that it was frustrating to me, because actually I know Rebecca a little bit. Our church brought her out last year to do a speaking event last summer to Seattle. And so I did a podcast with her, and I like her. Her background's interesting. She experiences same-sex attraction, and she writes about this in books. So I'm not telling anything out of school or anything else like that. So it's in her books, and she writes about it, and podcasts and that kind of stuff. So you can look it up. But so she had kind of like a phase where she was kind of same-sex attracted and that kind of stuff. She is now married to a man. and has a couple kids. And so she writes very interesting things about that. And so I don't know if that, to what extent that's informing her, or to what extent that has just led her to kind of cater toward certain people in her church experience and understand what they're going through. And so I think that that's part of like the concern that she has. But my gut reaction is I think she's hitting on a real problem, and maybe pointing to maybe some good solutions, but theologically I think that she's pretty wrong in some areas. I guess Cassidy, your experience, being single, do you feel catered to by the church? Like, do you feel left out? What is that? I guess I'm wondering, like, you seemed also interested in this topic, obviously. So like, and you're single. So like, do you feel like you're being left out? Do you think like there's something missing?
I have a lot of opinions about this, and I'm trying to be intentional with my words. I feel like it depends on the church. I've done a lot of church hopping in the last year, trying different denominations, trying to understand what different denominations believe and that stuff. As far as some of the churches that I have been to, it does feel like there is a certain pressure for young people to have their priority be marriage. And if you're not in that sort of bubble where that's what you want, you do sort of feel on the outs. Not to the point where I'm like, I'm leaving the church. Honestly, I'm in a weird situation where I'm very involved in church culture, but I'm also very involved in secular culture with what I do. And I can tell you for a fact, the pressures that you have in church culture is much better than the pressures that you have in secular culture. So I'm not sitting here saying, oh, I'm going to leave the church because of this. I think it's just, I think it's well-intentions that sometimes, I think I just have not a different perspective than most Christian people necessarily. I just think my personality type doesn't fit the ideal of what a Christian woman is necessarily. And so I always kind of get frustrated. I think it's bigger than just, marriage and that pressure. It's this pressure of what women are supposed to be. And I think it is heavier in some churches than others. Because I've been in some churches where, like I went to the Baptist church when I was in Australia, where there was no pressure of marriage, and we had a group of young adults, but there wasn't this pressure. Like, it felt like this matchmaker sort of thing. But then I've been to other churches where it really felt like that, and I'd been apologized to for there not being a lot of guys at an event, and I'm like, what? I don't care. It's just, yeah, I'd say it depends, but I do think there is something to this idea of this pressure to get married, but I don't think it just lies within like church culture necessarily. And maybe it's outside of marriage, it's just partnership in general.
So I had a thought. I'd like to throw this out. Maybe this is too insider baseball for people, but I don't know if people are familiar with the American Christian rapper Lecrae.
I know Lecrae.
Okay, so he had an interesting falling out with kind of the young, restless, and reformed movement a number of years ago. That was fairly public, and this is related, I think, in my mind, or at least I'm postulating that it's related in that I think within certain Christian subcultures, particularly a lot of the evangelical subcultures I was a part of, and I would say like the Joshua Harris subcultures, because Joshua Harris was in Sovereign Grace. That's the churches I attended for most of my adult life. Those are my people. So I think that they have I'm reminded almost of Jeff and I and someone had a conversation where we were talking about, maybe it was just me and Jeff, the Rhett and Link, our first Rhett and Link conversation. We were talking about how church culture is somewhat okay with people that they deem as other or conservative American church culture.
That was me. I was the
Was it
third
you?
person. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Sam. I love you. But they have a problem with people that they consider outside of the norm. I would say American conservative church cultures. And they are okay with people who are outside of the norm of like their prescription of what an ideal man or woman should be, as long as you are either in their mind on a journey toward somewhat becoming
the right
pretty,
direction.
Yep.
Yeah.
Somewhat becoming pretty identical to them or what you should be. And I think that's essentially what happened with Lecrae is, you're great. We love diversity. Oh, we love this outspoken Black rapper man to be part of our American white evangelical movement. You know, that's great street cred, isn't it, guys? But then when he started really getting into Black Lives Matter and saying things that was outside of the acceptable boundaries of what binds and blinds that particular evangelical tribe, they were like, we don't like this. And he was like, oh, you just like me as long as I think all the things you think. I think I don't know, there's something related to that spirit, I think, that deals with singleness. So like, I think those kinds of evangelical church culture are okay with singleness theoretically, but I think in real practice but they're always like, but you're going to get married. Right. And that's the goal. And everybody wants to get married. And then when that doesn't happen, I think them and the single people are kind of like, uh-oh, what do we do now? Like, we don't have any slots for this situation.
Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, what do you mean we're bad at singleness? We have a singles ministry. But
right.
the singles ministry is basically a dating app, right?
Right.
I think probably it seems like we're all nodding along. I think maybe we've all been to that singles ministry group before.
Yeah, met my wife in a small group. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's weird because, like, this is the last thing I'll add and I'll shut up. But, like, so I was married very early on in our church, but, like, my wife is a highly educated professional, and she was doing some of her training when we were at this church when we were very young. And she'll say to this day, like, she always felt very ostracized and on the outs and weird because she was pursuing a career, and that she wasn't like, because I think people outright asked her, like, you're just going to stop your education, right? And then just like stay at home and be a mom. Because like, that's what you do. Right. And listen, like, I'll go out. Like, I do think that is the normal. I think that is normal. I think moms are meant to mom and be at home and nurture and do that, but it's not, there's also exceptions to that, you know? And so I don't know. I think there's certain cultures that have a really hard time when people don't fit into their mental boxes. And then I think, like, that's why I would say is what I think we were feeling with her personal response to that was just like feeling that awkward tension, you know, of having it not work the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've always sort of been in this weird position in the church where I've actually enjoyed being single and found like the idea of relationships tiring. Like, there's very few people that I really connect with to the point where it's like, oh, okay, let's try this thing. And so growing up, that was always kind of celebrated, like, oh yeah, don't date. And then when I got to a certain age, then it started being like, but when are you going to date? When are you going to get married? And it's like this perspective of me being single is sad to them. And in my head, and I get that to a certain place, because there's a part where I'd like to be married. I'd like to have a partner and a person that I can, walk life with. But again, I'm also the person that's like, but if I can, marriage is not that thing that defines me. Like, if I can do something better with my life being single and more impactful and meaningful, I would rather do that. And so you're kind of in this weird, and I didn't grow up totally in that Joshua Harris culture, but it was close enough to where it is this weird dichotomy of, for so long, it's like, stay single, don't date, don't do anything. And then you hit 19 and they're like, well, are you going to marry this guy? And you're like, whoa, hold on. Like, this is, crazy. I don't know. So it's a weird dichotomy to live in. And, yeah, it's a hard balance where it's like, why is it everybody's like, oh, it's so sad that you could be single forever? Well, I don't always see it that way. It's like, but I could still do powerful things in the world. And how many people are in marriages and just stuck in a rut? I just don't want to settle for something that's not going to give my life meaning. And I think there's this weird dichotomy in the church sometimes.
Sarah, you've been pretty quiet.
Just processing. I'm also thinking about how, I don't know, there's almost an over availability of prospects. I feel like even in the last 10 years, when I was, well, now it's 13, 14, almost 15 years now, when I was looking for a prospective husband, I actually met my husband online, but that was when it was, just beginning to be something that was normal, and it still wasn't really normal. I'm kind of weird. And, but I feel like now it would be really difficult, almost because there's too many options. It's like, I've had single friends that have just been like, they would love to be married, but they're overwhelmed with all the dating apps and all the people trying to set them up and all of these things that are coming at them, that they do just kind of throw up their hands and say, I'm not even gonna try because it's too hard. And I don't know what to say about that. Another thing to throw out there is that I've thought about is, do we think that the loss of like a thriving monastic community has to do with the lack of a place for people who are called to serve God in that way?
I think that's a good point, because it's very clear to me that that's what Paul was talking about, right? When he's talking about it's better for someone to, be single versus married. Like, he's talking about a calling of a particular like ministry that you're supposed to do. What he's not referring to, and this is one of my theological issues with the thread, is she seems to be saying, well, singleness in general is not a tragedy and it's actually better and that kind of stuff. And you're like, well, there are different kinds though. Like, what Paul is saying is, I'm called to do this. I am called to do this. And here's what that looks like for me. And there's a particular ministry bent to it. And that's very different, I think, than someone who like really wants it, but for some reason they're not prospects, right? So she starts talking about like, well, within the church, there's more women than men. And so you might have all these women that want to get married, and that actually is something that they want, but like, there's not Christian men to marry or whatever. And I think that's a different discussion. I think we're equivocating a little bit between the two. I think it gets compounded also with, there are more women than men in the church. There are also more women than men in college. And like, so when we start looking at the areas where people end up like tending to find their spouse, it's very female heavy, and that can be hard. Like, whenever you have like a gender imbalance in that way, it ends up really messing things up. Both behaviorally, like men behave worse whenever they have more prospects relative to women, and vice versa. And I mean, that's a basic sociological fact, that people just start behaving differently whenever you have more options. I think that's very true. I think this is one of the things that I do think that it's interesting talking about. There's more women than men in the church, and what are women supposed to do? And so I don't want to like dismiss out of hand some of these critiques because of that, because I do think that I also like what you said, Sarah, about like the too many options thing. That's another like behavioral economics finding, that like whenever like you have a really large menu at a restaurant or too many choices of jelly at the store, not only does it take you longer to make a choice, but you're less happy with the choice that you made, because there's so many what ifs after that, right? Like, I could have chosen this, maybe I should have, and that kind of stuff. And so like, I think that's, you see the marriage, the average age of marriage going up, and then you see the divorce rate going up. And I think that's what we've done, is we've essentially created created marriage as like a commodity market where everyone's just like looking at all the options, and we just take too long to make a decision because we're thinking about it wrong. I think we're not thinking about it as a covenant. We're thinking about it as, yeah, I don't know, like I'm just buying jelly at the store or something
and
like
I
that.
think there can be a problem too with differentiating between call to singleness and call to being married. I think we could take a step above that and say, what are we all called to? If, if we're adopting a Christian telos, I guess, if you will, I think we're all called to self-sacrifice and we're all called to commitment. So maybe we should start there and figure out what that means. I also think that marriage is very refining. I don't know, I can pretty much guarantee that I would not have had the character to grow being single. I think marriage was something that forced me to have that shaping element that caused me to grow. And so, we've been reading lives of saints and martyrs with our kids lately. And just the character that these, especially, a lot of the women, young women too, that have been able to withstand pressures. I just think, I don't know. So it just seems like to be single takes a lot of character, and it's something that you just get with marriage that you and kids that you take for granted.
Yeah, no, I completely agree that, yes, for me also, like, I think Sam and you and I have talked about this before, but like, yeah, marriage is like a sanctifying force, right? You never realize how selfish you are until you get married. And I think it's kind of like, when you graduate college, you think that, oh, I was so busy in college, and then you have a job and you realize how much time you actually had. And then like eventually you get married and you realize, oh, I had a lot of time even when I had a job. And then you have kids and it gets even worse, right? You don't realize how selfish you are and how inwardly focused on your own wants until you get married. And I think it's like, there's a reason, again, so my second theological problem with the thing is the whole, like, the telos is not marriage or whatever. Like, telos is related to ontology. It's related to the kind of thing that you were created to be. And so Genesis is very clear that it is not good for you to be alone. Like, we were made, this is a part of your telos, even if it's not your calling to be married in this life. Like, it's not like the plan that God has for you. That doesn't mean it's not part of your telos in that sense, if we're going to use that term. I think I understood what she meant, but I think she's misusing the term there, and that was not right. That's enough. As a Thomist, that triggered me a little bit. And like, I immediately that was the first tweet, and so I immediately just wanted to go crazy about it. Because it is, and like, I don't think it's, because if we say it's part of the telos, then we are missing something by not having marriage. That doesn't mean that God can't use that missing thing to create something better that wouldn't have been there before. Like, all three work together for good, but we're not doing anyone any favors by saying, oh, it's not a big deal. Oh, it won't be hard. Oh, you're not missing something that is normal and was created for humans to experience. I don't think we're doing anybody any favors by pretending that's not the case. I don't think that's, I guess I don't think that's comforting, at least to like the women that I know that have struggled with this. I don't think that's going to be a comforting message to them, that be like, oh, actually it's better that you're single. Don't worry about it. And you're like, well, in a sense, maybe that's true. But in another sense, like this, like in the same way that like I've learned a lot, my wife and I had a miscarriage last fall. Like, did I learn something from that? Yeah. Did it bring me closer to my wife and to God? And in some ways, did God use that to better me? Yeah. Is that a loss? Absolutely, that's a loss. Absolutely, that hurts. Absolutely, that's not what God wanted, in at least some sense. And that's what I feel like sometimes we want to pretend like that's not the case. And we're like, oh no, this is perfectly normal for all these people to be getting married like closer to 30 and having one kid instead of multiple kids, or maybe not even getting married, just focus on your career. Because from my perspective, that is what the culture is kind of pushing people toward, is like, put off marriage. I see this with my sister. And, you know, she got married, then divorced, and then married again, and they put off having kids. And so now she's struggling to have kids. And so like, it's that pressure of like, don't like focus on you, get things right with you, do your career thing, and like, you know, build it up and whatever. So my sister got her PhD and all that kind of stuff. I see it sometimes with my wife is a dentist. So like we have a very interesting relationship where like she works part-time as a dentist, but she took 4 years to go through dental school while we were married to do it. So, and, you know, we put off having kids until afterwards. And so there was that pressure for her. Are you going to work full time? Are you going to stop working and that kind of stuff? But I feel like there's a lot of judgment on both sides for her. If she works, you know, then why aren't you home with your kids? And there's definitely that contingent of the Christian community. But then there's another contingent that's like, well, you know, you need to focus on your career. Like you're only working.
What was that dental degree for? Why are you wasting your school? Yeah.
Why don't you start your own practice? Why are you working for some other dentist and that kind of stuff? Well, you can't start your own practice working 2 days a week. And so anyway, so like I see both sides of that pressure, and I feel like what's being underplayed often is the extent to which our focus as a culture on autonomy and freedom and not making willing kind of constraints on our life is like, we're being encouraged to not do that, and, you know, go explore, go travel, go do your career, go, you know, whatever. And so I see that pressure a lot more than I see the other pressure. Not that the other pressure doesn't exist. So I'll stop talking now.
I think an interesting thing kind of in this whole discussion is how does a church how should a church use pressure and coercion to affect the behavior of its members on any topic, right? Like you could imagine if we just were talking about financial giving, right? Or something.
I thought you were going to say the Trinity.
No. I won't bring that up. I swore ahead of time I wasn't going to bring that up. So imagine it's like financial stuff or being generous to the poor, right? Like I think we all think that the church should do things to influence the behavior and attitudes of its members, and that's part of the purpose or telos of a church, is to be a conforming community that is pointing people towards greater Christ-likeness together, right? Yeah. But there are healthy and in between and very unhealthy forms of social coercion. And I'm sure that all of us in our church life have experienced the gambit of that. And so I think the question is what sort of what is the teaching on singleness and marriage? And then how should the church broadcast that and sort of enforce that in the methods that it has available in a healthy and productive way?
I mean, I'll just say, I'm just thinking about my kids. I've got 2 little boys. Like, I want to encourage them to prioritize marriage and kids. Like, I want them, because I think it's good, especially for men, to have that. And I don't want them to not have it, because I think that it is a huge sanctifying force. I'll speak for just my perspective and what I see with other men and all the small groups and all the churches that I've ever been to. Like, it is a good thing for men to have that. And I think it's good for women too, but I'll speak on behalf of all men. Like, I think it's good. And I think that the church should encourage that. That doesn't mean it's true for everyone, but I do think that should be the natural bent. And that should be kind of the encouragement, and the, like, this is what you should do. And this is what you should aim for. And we can make exceptions, but that's the general way that I would want my church, and I think my church does, but that's what I want my church to say to my kids whenever they're in Sunday school or whatever, like that.
So
well, maybe, oh.
No, go ahead, Luke. So I think for me, I've never seen marriage as a negative thing. I had felt the pressure, and the problem itself is not the pressure. I think sort of the underlying fear underneath that pressure is what sort of bothered me, which is this idea that, you know, kids are going to have sex outside of marriage, and we want to avoid that. And so you have, when you're young, kids, you know, don't date, do this purity culture thing, you know, teach them, you know, not to have sex. And then once you start dating and you're young adults, it's like, let's get them married as quickly as possible so they have no chance of messing up. And then, and again, I'm not against young marriage. I thought I was going to get married young. But I think sometimes that pressure can get in the way of, well, what is God actually asking you to do? Because I do think there's some cases where marriage is not what God is asking people to do. And like I've talked to people who have had experiences where they got married and they knew that God was asking them not to get married, but they did anyways and felt the repercussions of that. And so I think there is that, and it's not just the church, it's culture in general, that, you know, being in a partnership and having a partner can fulfill you, make you whole. And there's definitely things that can help you grow within a partnership. But what I have found is that there's also seasons that you need singleness to grow closer to God. And like, I look at my past relationship, the reason I ended the engagement was I was at a place where I needed to figure out my stuff emotionally, mentally, and just get on a page before I could commit. And, you know, I thought, you know, I'm just going to work through that and eventually get back together. And the minute I let go of that relationship is when I was able to grow so much closer to God in a way that I never was within that relationship, and understanding that I was complacent, and then down the line realizing, oh man, the where we are now just isn't compatible at all. And like, I think there was a good thing that it ended. But there's this sort of culture that's been bred in me that love is more than just a feeling, it's a commitment. And I still believe that, but I think sometimes it makes you just grin and bear it and like bite down through something that maybe is just not right. And it's a hard balance for people to navigate that, because on one hand, I do think that those things are true and that it can help you grow. But I think sometimes there is this pressure that if you get in a relationship and, you know, have a certain sort of commitment, like marriage is just hard when maybe it's, you know, you're just not as compatible with that person. It's okay to say that.
Marriage isn't the end either. It's not like everyone who gets married just learns what they should learn and it, you know, goes perfectly. Like, it has to go beyond that. It kind of reminds me of just the kind of the attitude in a lot of the evangelical churches of, you know, just confessing that you believe and that you're saved, and okay, you know, I mean, we can't do marriage that way either. Like, it takes more than just getting married. There has to be support.
Yeah. Well, and I think what becomes hard with single women in churches is because these people are getting married so young. If you're older and you're getting married, for women, and this goes back to sort of this idea of making relationships and marriages marketable, where you hit a certain age as a woman in the church and you start feeling this pressure of, oh, I got to get married, but people around your age or a little older are dating younger women. And so you hit this threshold point where it's like, there's not a lot of people in this pool. Like, your pool is even smaller of eligible singles in a certain way. And so there's always this pressure. It's like, you should be looking for that. But there's times where it's like, I don't know, there's that balance of like, how do you get outside of that marketableness, but also be able to do what you need to do to work through the things as a single person to get to a place where, you know, you're entering marriage in a stronger foundation. It's a weird balance.
Mm-hmm. I think so. I've been listening to the Rouse Dothit stuff that Paul's been talking about a lot, and sort of, you know, birth rates and decadence and all that sort of thing. And Eric Weinstein talks about it a lot too. There's sort of the idea, and I think this is still fundamentally true, that like 90 to 95% of people will need to get married, couple up, have 2 or more children, and somehow make enough money to have that work over the course of their lifetime in a household. And if society isn't able to do that, then it will eventually, it's on the road towards failing in some degree or another. And it can stave that off with immigration or other patch measures. But at the end of the day, if that's fundamental, sustainable, self-sustaining core gets lost, then the whole show is sort of lost. And I think that's a message that's not getting said enough. But there is still the message that could be said in addition to that, that singleness can have a role in that too. And that previously, like I think Sarah, you mentioned it, like, you know, Protestantism no longer has monasteries and convents and a celibate priesthood and stuff like that. Like Christianity used to have very clear roles. Okay, if you're not getting married, there are these very special things that you can do, and they're super holy. But they're also super holy in the sense that it's not for most people, right? And like I was in there was a debate between Brett Weinstein and Richard Dawkins that was actually strangely relevant to this, where Brett Weinstein was making the point to Richard Dawkins, hey, look at Catholicism. The reason why they have the single people is it helps the mean complex regenerate so that they can have enough babies. And even though they're sacrificing some small proportion of people to be celibate priests, the overall health of the community is actually strengthened by that sort of thing, like eusocial naked mole rats, I think was his comparison. So like there needs to be the recognition that singleness is dependent upon married people procreating people, that in a way that marriage isn't dependent on single celibate people in quite the same way that single celibateness is dependent upon marriage for its regeneration. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a place for singleness, and that it doesn't mean that there isn't a way that the sustaining core can't benefit from sort of, I don't know, the edge, as I think talked about it earlier.
And I guess that's my problem with the thread, and just in terms of tone, it seemed to be wanting to push the exception to make it more normal. And that's where I was like, I don't think that's healthy. I'm not saying that we need to, like, you know, ostracize the exceptions, because the exceptions can play a really good role, but it seemed to be suggesting that we should kind of treat them as the same, or throw it out there to kids that, like, hey, like, don't worry about it and that kind of stuff. And I don't think that that's healthy either. I think that could be really, really damaging, actually.
One of the things that I was sort of thinking, I wonder if sort of our individualist mindset in the West has created more of the problem for singles than just this idea that marriage is great. Because I think now you have, when you get married, you become this individual family, and that's your community. Whereas, you know, in the past, people used to live more communally. There used to be more support within communities, and now it's more individualistic. And so when like, I've had so many people tell me, like, oh, when my friend gets married, that's the end of our friendship. Whereas, you know, because it feels like they become in their little bubble, and then they have a family, and then that's their world. I wonder if that has more to do with this problem of singles feeling outside than any of the pressures.
Well, and part of that is true. I mean, I don't keep in touch with very many of my friends from high school or college. It kind of drops away. And there are a lot of things that you think are important that just drop away after you get married. I mean, I very adamantly said I would not have more than 3 kids. Here we are, number 4. I very adamantly said I would never homeschool, and I would probably keep working. Here I am. You know, it's just, you just kind of don't know until it happens.
And there are lifestyle problems too. Like, even if you want to keep up with someone and that kind of thing, you can't, like, there's not a day where, you know, one of my single friends can just, like, text me and be like, hey, you want to go bowling or something? I'm like, no, my kids, like I've got to feed them and bathe them, and I got to go to bed, and I'm going to be exhausted. So no, I'm not going. It's Wednesday night. No, thank you. So like you just can't in the same way that you could before. So like your lifestyle rhythms are sufficiently different, even that, and that's another thing that I think that often I've found often single people. We had this problem in one of the small groups that we were in a couple of years ago, where you had like kind of half married couples and then like, you know, like 4 or 5 single people. But like they would want to do things, and all the married couples were like, I got kids, I got a baby. I'm not going roller blading or whatever.
The activity can't span putting to bedtime. It needs to be
exactly.
before bedtime or after bedtime.
And after bedtime, I'm too tired and I'm going to bed. That's my bedtime too. That's not going to happen. And so I think that's part of the problem too, is I feel like there's a feeling sometimes with single people that they're being ostracized, like it's like intentional, whereas in reality it's like no one's trying to do anything. It's just like we're just in a different place right now. I can't behave as if I'm single. That's not going to be a thing. Like if you want to hang out with me on a weeknight, I need like 2 weeks advance notice and permission from my wife before that's going to happen. Otherwise it's just not. Like you text me the day before, it's just not happening. Sorry.
Well, and I think that's where the role of maybe someone older and single could play in that situation. Like I'm thinking of myself, say as a high school student, and I wouldn't have spent time talking with a 30-year-old mom, but we had a couple of single girls that were, you know, around 30-ish that I would have long conversations with because they did have that time and resources to sit down with me and talk about that stuff. And they felt more relatable because they weren't moms. So, you know, I think, and that's where it goes back to, you know, what I was saying earlier about commitment. Like I've seen single people live their whole, not their entire lives, but, you know, a good chunk of their lives being single, and they've thrived, but it's because they have intentionally committed themselves to something. You know, whether that be the kids that they teach at school or their church family, whatever it is. I know it's possible, but I just don't think it's talked about enough. And I don't think that it's emphasized enough.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm independent to a fault, and I can sometimes, you know, try to go on, whether it's in relationships or just tasks alone. And I think in the last couple months I've sort of had to battle with that. Is being alone more beneficial for me? And I've gotten to a place for myself, I don't think it is. But then I've also gotten to a place where that doesn't mean that I'm just gonna find someone to couple with and make it work. It's like I also want to have that balance of, I want to do it not just because I think it's good to be with someone. It's also really bad to be with someone who is not right, if that makes any sense. So there's just that balance, and I have a very strong personality and I'm very driven, and I think because of that, it makes it really hard for me to find partners who are compatible, especially in church, because I don't fit that box of what people think of as this, like, you know, Christian wife who's gonna like do the bake sales and stuff. That's not me.
You're so mouthy.
I do have a big mouth. I'm very opinionated, I'm very driven, and I think I because of I do think I can be intimidating a certain way and just, you know, run over people. And I don't think that most men like that.
Yeah, I think so. What I've been thinking is that, I don't know, a long time ago, and it's just kind of stuck with me as an undercurrent. Tripp, you asked, no, who asked her? Tripp or Sam? Sam did. How the church should enforce it. I always forget you, Sam. How the church should enforce these things. And my instant thought, because it's now my constant writer, was passively, liturgically, versus just like in your head telling you what to do. And I think that's true, because I think the problem, no matter what, at any level, becomes that, because I'm also relating and resonating with what you're saying, Cassidy, because I don't think the answer is just is also just like, just commit, just buckle up, just pull up your bootstraps, find that incel, you know, marry him up, you know, and just make it
Civilize
work.
him, beat him into
Civilize
shape.
it, make him lovable. Yeah, love him into lovability, you know, just
Turn
like,
your beast into the prince and it'll happen. Yeah.
you know, my dad said beauty is a light switch away. Sorry. That's terrible. I apologize. So, anyhow, but
I have no idea where you were going.
That took me a
Liturgy.
second, but that
Something
was
about
really funny.
liturgy.
but I think the problem is, right, is that liturgies train you not only individually, but communally, nationally, family, and a lot of that bodily, and a lot of that is subconscious. And so it's really hard, I think, to tell someone in their head, buckle up and commit, when you don't have that reinforced at every level. And that's what I would kind of say is, does this culture of American evangelical individualism, even though they espouse a commitment to marriage, do they at all the levels? They definitely say they do. And I think there's certain cultures that really try to enforce it, like you were saying, Sam, in a certain way. But I don't, ultimately, I guess I just don't think that's how human beings work, because then you end up just telling people something to do that they just feel like they can't, which I think is kind of where you are, Cassie. It's like this, because I think part of you wants that, but I think I'm not going to say the reticences that you're feeling are probably like 100% right and pure, because nothing is, but I think a lot of it is, at least seems to me. And I think that's because it's not as easy as just like, you know, that mental, I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to make this work. I'm just going to, well, never mind. That was going to be too personal. I'll share that after.
I mean, I definitely feel like I have my own personal issues and frustrations with the church that are outside of just, you know, seeing that there's a problem. I have my own issues, and I acknowledge those and work through those. I think where I get really frustrated, and this probably is partly emotional, is this pressure of using God as the reason to marry. Like, it's like that's what like kind of frustrates me about sort of dating, when my experience with dating evangelical people, where they use God as the scapegoat of why they don't want to be with me or something else, or why I should be with them, when it's like, why can't you just say something practically? Like, I once was told, oh, I just really want to focus on my relationship with God right now. And then a month later, he was in a relationship with someone else. And it's like, just tell me you don't like me. Just tell me you want to be with somebody else. That's much better. But it's this spiritualized marriage where it's like, okay, I get it. There's a God side and there's a practical side, but in this religious area, but there's also this balance too. It just, I don't know if that makes any sense.
I do think that the church is missing a lot of the practical aspects of dating and choosing who to marry. But then beyond that, once you get married, because I grew up kind of it was really heavy in the I kissed dating goodbye crap, and I hated that stuff so much. But like, it was very much like, okay, here are the rules. You've got some rules around sex and what you can't do. You need to get married so you don't have sex before you can't stand it anymore, and you do it. And so, like, get married and then you can have sex and things will be fine. And you're like, well, wait, like, I feel like I'm missing a lot before and after that, other than those rules. And so I do think that it's true that I think that the church has done a really bad job, at least in kind of the Protestant circles that I've been around, both in the singleness, but then also in the marriage. I think that sometimes that gets discounted too. Is there's a lot of books on marriage that people write, and Christians and that kind of stuff, but practically in the church, the ministries are very, I feel like, anemic and like
Yeah.
what exactly are you like? People have real problems in marriage. Marriage is hard, which is another reason why I don't like the idea of going around and being like, hey, don't worry about it. You know, like, yeah, get married, don't get married, whatever. I was like, actually, like, marriage is a sacrifice. It's a willing constraint on a lot of things, and it's going to be really, really hard. And so I don't think it needs any discouragement. I think that like everyone kind of like sense it. Like if you've ever dated anyone, you're like, it'd be better to not make this permanent, right? Like at least then I've got a parachute. I've got an out that I can have and that kind of stuff. And so like, especially Christian marriage, where we're saying, okay, no, we're not going to encourage divorce. Like we're not going to encourage that kind of stuff. Like this is your decision. This is supposed to be for life. That's a really big decision. And then having kids and that kind of stuff, this is hard. You are taking options away from yourself willingly by doing this. And so I do think that like the church has not done a good job in ministry, either to single people or to married people. But I don't think the answer is to try and equate singleness, like push that kind of exception to the center. I think that would be really damaging because, man, get that leap like is hard, right? To say like, yes, I'm going to marry this person. And I don't think it needs any discouragement. Like, I feel like we're all kind of like, we all, you know, the other four of us have gotten married, and I'm sure at some point during that engagement or that thing, you're like, should I not? Like, is this right? Is it not? Like everyone has that because it's a scary prospect.
Yeah, I think you said something too of this whole idea of, you know, jumping into marriage. I think for most religious people, the roles of marriage for men and women are scary. In some ways, it's scarier for women if you kind of hold to the men leadership, whatever role, where there's a big part of what you're giving up in a control aspect that I think can be hard. I mean, that's a whole Pandora's box there, but I just think there is a different pressure for women of what it means to enter a marriage and giving up of certain like rights that is difficult.
I actually think that would be an interesting topic if we want to go there. I think that's interesting. Like, because I mean, I think that's fair, right? I mean, it is, you have a lot of, like, if that is what we're teaching, you know, as Christians, like the marriage to be like, and you're saying, well, so this guy's got to be my leader and this is a permanent arrangement. Like what?
No egalitarians allowed, huh, Tripp?
No. Well, I'm saying if you can feel free to disagree, but at least like that, you know, a lot of that is like the, you know, that is, I think that at least in the circles that I've been in, that has been like kind of the dominant perspective. So if I get why that would be scary. I
mean, I might be an outlier for modern women, but I don't necessarily find that distasteful. Like I actually find that there is a part in me that wants somebody to just, you know, be a man, like, and, you know, be a leader. But I also don't want to, I think in that, because I have a strong personality, I don't want to just like give that autonomy to anybody. Like you want to give it to someone who you trust and you think can actually do that well. And so there's that dynamic too.
I think that's where finding someone who compliments you in that way. I mean, in a lot of ways, my husband and I, even though our roles are traditional, the way we relate is not. Like I tend to sometimes have more of the, I don't know, the independent leadership type drive. And, you know, so those roles, there's a lot of wiggle room there, I think. And it is difficult when you feel like it has to be this certain way. I was going to say something else, but I lost it. So.
Well, and also like masculinity and femininity and what those things really look like and what does it mean to lead, especially in I would say a Christ-like way versus a stereotypically kind of American corporate worldly way, are really different things too. And so I don't like, even, I don't know, and maybe this is just word you threw out flippantly, but even like giving, Cassie, you said autonomy. Like a leader that is autonomous is not being a Christ-like leader, I would say. I don't know. And it's one of, like, that's a topic that's just, it's rife for problems. Cause I mean, I was around those debates for a long time. And I think very few people who have problems with male headship, I would say, probably understand what people who advocate it are really saying. And also there's a big difference between the way that it's taught and advocated and then the way that it's practiced also, you know?
Right. I think there's definitely a lot of nuance to it, and I'm not this kind of person I'm definitely not the person that thinks what is typically designed in that rule means that for all people, all times, all places. I think there's a balance. I think it's hard because when a man is told to be a spiritual leader, they get this idea of what it's supposed to be, and then they play this role, and then I think it ends up not. It's very hard to parse apart what is genuine and not a lot of times in churches. Yeah. And that, I think that's the scariest thing for me as far as getting into a marriage, of like, what my main focus is doing what God wants me to do and the best for that, and to sort of hand that and be in a partnership and hand that over. You want to make sure someone's doing that too. But it's very hard to know that.
But let's go back a little bit. What exactly are you handing over? Like, what does that conjure up to you?
Well, I guess in the end, like, if two people have very different kind of ideas, I think C.S. Lewis talked about this once, and it sort of made, I didn't agree with all of his points, but it made more sense. When you have two people and divorce is not an option, eventually, you know, one's going to happen to the other. So if one person's saying, you know, I want to move to Africa, and the other one saying, no, we're going to stay and, you know, do suburban life or whatever, you can't just go off and do both things. Eventually that's going to happen. And I think, and maybe, and I don't know, I think there's obviously nuance, but, and like, I do think that there is some truth in like being able to trust the guy as a spiritual leader to be able to make that decision. Like, I think it just practically makes sense. And so I don't know, and maybe that's still this evangelical, very conservative part of me that is bred in, but that's sort of how I see that makes sense. Like, when it comes to compromise, like, there has to be that sort of respect in a certain way. I think even sometimes the way that it's taught there, I don't know, there is just this sort of, I don't know, I have my issues with the whole submission thing too. I battle with it because in some ways I'm like, can agree with it and understand it, and then some ways like it, yeah. So I don't know, I think that is something I'm still battling with.
I'm still battling with that.
Yeah. So it's hard to put it into words that I feel strongly standing behind.
So this is just my own personal thing. I think I've said this. It was in like a voice chat once. I think I was talking to Matt Allison. But if I had to just list probably the most, like, the occurrence in my marriage that happened that was probably the most Christ-like, and like, in a way, almost nothing. It was a moment. I'm thinking of like the book Loris, where something happened, and like the effects of that happening have been playing out ever since. But the thing that happened to me that I think was probably most Christ-like was when my wife was in this intense period of training, and I think we had like all three of our kids, I think, were 3 and under or something, or 4 and under or something. I don't know. They were all very small. And I was just within the first couple of years of staying home full time, which is what I do. And I wasn't really seeing her at all. And we had gotten into a big fight, and I was just completely isolated, and it was really dark. I don't know. I had this period where I remember writing in a journal something like, just stop doing everything you want completely. Don't do anything you want. Don't think about it. Don't pursue it. It's not about what you want. Stop doing anything you want. And I think, and obviously that didn't happen, you know. But I think it was the beginning of a shift in me, because I think this is just the irony. Like, I think Christ-like leadership isn't compromise and leading and adjudicating arguments and being like, well, listen here, young lady, this is how it'll go. You know, I think it's
good luck with that. Yeah.
well, right. I mean, I think it's, no matter how you want to play it, or like you said, role play, I think that's a telling word. It's a telling way to talk about it. No matter how you do it, I think to follow Christ in his leadership is to die to yourself. So that's a really weird thing, I think, about male headship, is it just means like you die to yourself, you give up your agency, you give up your rights, you give up your will, and that's a hard, I mean, I don't know how to write that rule book, because it's impossible. I mean, it's going to be really different for everyone. And this, I don't know, and that's another thing that I've been thinking through this whole thing, is I don't think, it's another reason why I think the church's influence should be liturgical and passive, is because I really, really believe tell the truth, or at least don't lie. And I think only you can do that. I don't think anybody else can do that for you. I think the church can influence you on all those other levels, that it informs your community, your family, yourself, your body. But just trying to tell you what to do, like just try harder, through the soul mechanism of your head, isn't going to work. And I think, I don't know. So like the headship thing and is very misunderstood, I think. And I think even for guys that advocate it and want to do it, because I mean, I think I practiced that way for the first part of my marriage. Like, I thought my job was to be like the spiritually mature one that just like told us what to think and corrected doctrine and got us in the right habits. And I've moved a lot more to really, like, my job is to take the log out of my eye, pretty much, which I'm still not that great at. But
I think that there are sort of like, there are different ways in which I think the church has failed on the singleness front and on the marriage front. And then I think there are different ways in which the church has failed for women and for men, right?
Yeah.
And all, right, 2x2 quadrant, right?
Yeah.
So I think that one of the ways that the church has failed on the marriage, like in the original tweet that got us all talking, she mentioned this, that there are almost always more women in church than men. And that seems to be universal across denominations and across time and across cultures even, perhaps. And so it's like, what's going on with there? So that's at least a clue that it's not American evangelicalism's fault. But there is perhaps things that American evangelicalism could do to mitigate whatever that problem is. And like, I could, like, Cassidy, I totally understand what you're saying about how terrifying it would be to be asked to submit. Because it's like, well, church, are you going to be turning me out Christ-like guys who really are going to shoulder that responsibility for everything that means in a way that I can trust into that, and that I'm not going to be harmed or burnt or have the ball dropped on me for? That is a perfectly valid question to ask. And I think that the church is not doing a good job of turning out men who are ready and able to enter into that agreement at the rate that it's turning out women who are ready and able to be ready for that engagement. And yet the blame seems to get more heavily put on women, because the women are the one at least still showing up. And the men are, who knows where they are. They're in the basement covered in Cheetos or wherever the heck they
Preach.
are. And so they don't get the heat because they're not even in the building, right? So I don't know where I'm going with that. I'm not sure what the solution is. I think Jordan Peterson was kind of tapping into that problem. I think he sort of stumbled on that. I think he found himself addressing that problem in a way that had been abdicated, and he didn't mean to ever end up there. But how does the church get the guys to show up, like when, because I was single for a while in church, but when you're a 23-year-old guy who has a decent job and you're showing up to church, no one's going to give you a hard time. They're glad you're there, and it's sort of like Luke said, it's the assumption that you'll get married pretty soon. And 23, 24, okay, fine, you don't need to be married yet, but we're glad you're here, and so look around because there are some ladies for you. That's sort of the unspoken thing. And so I lost my train of thought, but the church needs to do a better job at attracting the single guys to keep going to church into their 20s or whatever, and be explaining to them that marriage isn't just a giant honeymoon, right? The reason to enter into marriage isn't because you finally get to release your sex drive, which is really kind of what that what's his name, Joshua
Harris. Yeah.
Joshua Harris, that was kind of like how that was the frame around this whole thing. Hey, you have a sex drive, we've got a solution for you, right? That was kind of how it was set up. But marriage is a big, giant, slogging sacrifice, and being the head, even if you get to be the head in your marriage, the number of constraints on you, like, okay, you need to pay a mortgage. How much does that cost? That costs that much? Okay, car payments. Okay, how many kids do you want? Oh, I want 3 or 4. Okay, well, there's college, there's preschool, there's all those things. Oh, that costs how much? And that costs how much time? And it's like, wait a minute, where are my degrees of freedom in this situation again? I don't even, so I don't even feel like I have choices. I feel like there's that thing that you're supposed to do, keep doing it. Right, that's sort of what it looks like sometimes to be the head, and I don't think we prepare guys for that enough. And I'm not looking for sympathy or saying that guys have it worse than the girls or something like that, but I do think there are specific ways in which the church has failed to prepare guys for marriage, and that's something that I specifically feel kind of strongly about.
Yeah, no,
you could have changed it. You could have been like nonstop gerbil wheel, but sex.
No, I think that's totally true, and I completely I will echo all of those sentiments, because that's how I feel, that like actually being the head, like however we want to define that, should be terrifying. Like I think it's fair for you to say like it's scary to submit to someone who's going to be the head, but that's a huge responsibility. Like however we define that, that should be terrifying. To you, that should be like that shouldn't be something that you're like, oh, I'll just take responsibility for all of these things, because like, so I have responsibility for all of these things, and I have responsibility to do it well for someone that I love, someone maybe that's going to bear children. This is really stressful actually, and this person is probably going to be standing next to me kind of looking at me like, this guy's an idiot, and so like, this guy really, and so like, it should not be like this power grab, like, glorious position that we think that, like, whatever we mean by complementarianism and male headship, it can't be that. It can't be dictator, like he gets all the credit and I'm just going to sit there. Like, that's not, that in no way is that biblical. In no way would I say that's Christian. And in no way.
And even if you did do that, even if like you did that for a week, how happy would you be at the end of that week, Tripp? Like, how well would things be going for you if you tried to be a tyrant in your house for a week?
Oh,
like it would suck.
Yeah.
Give me about 15 minutes of that before like my house has become like hell to me. Yeah, no, that.
I mean, yeah, I definitely don't envy that position and don't want that position. I think on the other hand, there is that, and I think I'm kind of realizing that now, the flippancy of how that is taken in churches and like, I've honestly, in my experience, seen people outside of the church, outside of the church, take more, how do I want to say it? Take that sort of idea more responsibly than people inside the church, and that's sort of frustrating, where you're kind of at a rock and a hard place where you don't want to compromise. You don't want to compromise certain deep values, but there are times where I tend to align in bigger thinking and life, life choices and way that I live outside of my faith than I have in it. And that's just a hard thing to see.
Yeah, I had one question for Luke. You talked about you want, kind of the teaching to be kind of liturgical on this. Did you have like a particular like example or something in mind for what like a liturgy that would trickle down at all these levels would look like for marriage, or a set of liturgies that would do that? Like, is there a good example that you know of or you could think of? Because that isn't, I do think that is something that would be useful.
I wouldn't say that I have like a specific in mind, or I'd even be able to articulate what it is, because I think that's kind of the thing with good liturgies, is they inform you at all the levels that are beyond your conscious level, and I think that's why they're cultural and familial and bodily, and so it's the thing that informs you to act in a way that you maybe don't even understand, but it's rightly oriented. And that's why I think, like, if you have a culture, it's the religious substrate that's underneath cultures. And I think if you have a culture that really values marriage, and not just in principle, but in a reality that manifests in tons of different ways, that those kind of liturgies will be there. I don't know. The best church liturgy, from my opinion, obviously, is the one where I am, because that's why I'm there, which would be Orthodoxy. I think, and I like ancient church liturgies, because I think in a very heuristic way, they've been shown to last in almost like a, what's his name?
Chesterton fence.
Well, Chesterton fence, but also that atheist that's used to talk with Paul Moore, whatever his name is. He always likes to argue heuristics, and what lasts is necessarily the good, but I think that is a good way to look at it, at least somewhat. I don't know. I don't have a really obvious, straightforward answer to that, Tripp. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. I like the idea of having liturgy specifically that are just kind of like infused into the church, that pushes this kind of down, that doesn't necessarily need to be like, here's the 12-step program to singleness and dating and, marriage or whatever. I like the idea that, yeah.
Because I think the problem with having, like, we value marriage being mainly in your head and mainly preached from the pulpit and mainly this theoretical thing that doesn't really have any other way to manifest, in all those other levels, is that you end up, and with the gospel of just try harder. It's like, if it's not working, well, that's just do it harder. If it's not, commit. Well, just commit, and then just buckle down and commit. Because that's, I think when that's your frame, when your frame is just working at that level, that is your only viable answer when it's not working, is just do it better.
I think another weird aspect to this is that, like, there's the church culture, right? And there's wider American culture. And a decent number of you guys grew up in the South, where there was less of a gap between those two things. And I, like, growing up in Chicago, being an evangelical Christian was always a cultural minority, right? And I was, a weird minority within the minority that didn't even quite fit in. But even then, there was I'm not from the Bible Belt, right? And so the rest of my high school had a totally different script on what dating and sex was than my church or the youth group that I went to at Willow Creek, right? And so I think that the weird thing that's happening is that, even the Christian part of our larger culture is really starting to drain away. And there was still, even when we were kids, even for me, and more so I think to people who grew up in the South, a closer alignment between wider culture and church culture. And I think by the time that my daughter's a teenager, that will be even less the case than it was for me. And so how does that work? What is the script that we're giving our kids on dating and marriage and singleness? And how will that fit into a wider culture that disagrees and stuff like that? And I just really have no idea how that's going to work, because I feel like that liturgical stuff that Luke's talking about, it works best when the whole culture is Christian, right?
Yeah.
Like imagine in Russia a couple hundred years ago, right? When the whole culture is Eastern Orthodox and that liturgy is just seeping down into everything. It's different when it's your own isolated thing, and those expectations are just something that you kind of see only on Sunday, and you get a very different message Monday through Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. It's like, how do you know you value marriage culturally and religiously and value having children? You get married, you stay married, and you have lots of kids, broadly. Like, that's how you know. I don't know. Sorry, that's all.
I think it's hard too, because I think in broader culture and secular culture, you have two different scripts of what marriage is for men and for women. For men, it's this this prison and like avoid it at all costs. And for women, even in the more sort of independent woman phase that we have right now, there is still this goal of finding that partner that completes you, whether it's marriage or not. And so that right there, these two very different scripts make it even harder to, I think, find that marriage in secular culture. And I sometimes I think it seeps through to church culture.
I mean, average age of marriage and, divorce rates and all these kind of things, they've gone up in the church, kind of correlated with what's going on in the culture. Like, it is true that divorce rates are lower for people who regularly attend church and that kind of stuff. But they're following the same vector in terms of like age of marriage and all that kind of stuff. So it's not as if they're completely separated. And that's why to go back to something Sam said earlier, we have the guy problem, right? Not enough guys are being prepared for the women that we're producing. Like, I wonder if you could take like a Petersonian kind of tact to this in terms of talking to guys about it, that this is not just a sexual release for you. It's actually like, this is in some ways, like, Peterson wasn't giving you he was giving like some self-help stuff, but it wasn't like a feel-good story, right? A lot of it was like, pick up your cross and carry it kind of messages, like clean your own room, like become something worth desiring to other people and that kind of stuff. I wonder if we start talking about marriage that way, to give guys like, it's a goal, but it's a goal I have to achieve. It's something I have to work for, something I have to prepare for. It's something like that. And not just, it's a thing I do so I can have sex without finger wags. Because then in a wider culture where you can have sex without finger wags without marriage, like, why would I do this, right? And also, if there's something in the church that's giving guys that message of, hey, here's something, a path worth pursuing that's meaningful, that you will like, it's good. I even think that's going to appeal to guys that in a broader culture with no meaning, right? With kind of like this like emptiness and kind of like nihilism. I do think that like, if you give guys that vector, then it might actually end up attracting more guys to the church, which you saw with Peterson. It's like, now you have people like filling like huge rooms listening to a Bible lecture, like that, which is crazy. A 2-hour Bible lecture on like 2 verses of the Bible. That's nuts. That's nuts. It's nuts, especially given that half of those people were not Christians. Like, a lot of those people that were attending those lectures were not actually Christians. And I saw Peterson when he came to Seattle. Like, most of the people in that room were not Christians. They weren't, but they were there to hear something about the
You're
Bible.
in Seattle.
I know, in Seattle. Yeah, it's crazy. Like, it was, they filled the theater. They filled a theater, and there was like, I guarantee that like maybe 10 or 15% of the people in that room were regular church attenders. Like, the vast majority were not. And so,
well, I almost guarantee though that Peterson, I bet there are going to be a lot of guys that get married down the road who maybe never would have because of Peterson, or who become a lot more viable candidates, because that's his thing. It's not just self-help in and of yourself. It's clean up your room, clean up your life, get married, have kids, have a really great family, have a really great neighborhood, have a really great community. It expounds out in a ripple effect for the whole world. I mean, that's why it works that way. And Peterson was all about that. And so then that's the thing. So here's an interesting thing. I don't know if you guys know this. Sarah probably knows this, but like, hugely, the biggest percentage of people who convert to Orthodoxy are men. So like, that is a huge difference within the evangelical church and the Orthodox church. It's a very, I would say it's balanced, because ethnically you're getting a lot of women and things too, but converts are by and large hugely men, and a lot of that is because and this isn't that women don't like hard things, but Orthodoxy is not easy. Like, Orthodoxy is not a simple thing where you just show up and great, you're on board. Like, it's kind of a
marriage in a lot of ways.
huh
It's like a marriage in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I would say becoming Orthodox is a lot more akin to getting married. And so I mean, I don't know how that all relates to the marriage thing in American culture, but I agree with you. I think men need a message of, because that's what will produce a lot more viable candidates, because this is the truth. And I've never really said this because I feel bad for like some of the single guys, because there's a lot of great single guys, I think, in this Discord community and things, but like, I have 2 daughters. I don't, just through my life and through my experience and through like friends and girlfriends that my wife and I have and different things, like, I'm not super optimistic about the options for women out there. Like, there's not a lot of guys that I'm normally super excited about that are just like, wow, you're really great in a lot of levels. Like, I try to imagine a lot of guys out there that I know right now that I'm just like, man, if my daughters were older, I'd be like, sweet. There's not a lot of them, So I think that's true. That's how men could lead, even as single men. Don't be a loser.
Yeah. No, I think guys need a direction, I guess, is my thing. Like, they need something to aim for. And I think that's what that kind of language is what Peterson gave that attracted so many men. And I think that would be helpful on both sides of the equation, because we don't want loser guys, and we don't want girls that don't want loser guys sitting there being like, well, that's my only option right now, because that's all that we're producing. Sorry, Sarah, I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to say, just the lack of mentors, at least within the churches that my husband and I have been in, is just, we have desired to have maybe an older couple to talk through some of our issues with. And we just think through all the people, and we think, just not anybody that we respect enough, that we see that that their lives are heading in a direction that we would like to follow. And that's, maybe that's just hubris on our part, being younger and think we know more. But at the same time, I think there is a real lack of that growth and maturity that, for a young husband, a young single guy, even an older man with kids, like, you need that person that's down the road from you that you can look to their life and say, I want to follow this path. Can you help me? And it's a mutual relationship. So I can understand. My husband and I both have really strong families, and so that's kind of filled that role for us. But not having that, it would be really scary to just dive in and feel like you don't have that support. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're coming up on an hour and a half. Any closing topics that we wanted to chat about?
Oh, we could try and figure out how LGBT questions fit into this whole thing. Do we have enough time for that?
Don't.
Not unrelated, though.
No, it's not. That's true. I just think yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, I was just going to say one little last thing, and then I'm probably spent. But I had a Old Testament professor actually in college, and he was Jewish, and he said that, and I'm not sure how accurate it is, but I love it. The actual Hebrew translation of helpmate, that's usually translated as helpmate in Genesis, is a fitting adversary. And I feel like that is so appropriate because it's someone who and those of you who are married, I think, will relate to that too. It's someone who contradicts you in the right way.
Yeah, or in the wrong way until you both shave off enough of that area that's rubbing up against, so then you can fight without it being. Yeah, no, that's definitely true. Anyway, but no, I actually think that it's a good thing, like, kind of point to close on, Sam, is that, you know, when we're talking about singleness and like, all this has to be situated within a wider discussion of, you know, it can't just be about like the single women who can't find things in the church. Like, this is part of a really large discussion. It includes LGBT, it includes young men who aren't being prepared, it includes people who are called full-time to ministry and maybe are in that kind of Pauline situation where this is what I'm going to do. And it includes people who weren't necessarily widow. It includes like a lot of stuff. And so I don't think that this is that's one of the things I don't want, like, if the church is going to tackle this, it can't just be, hey, we need a nicer ministry to single women in their 25 to 40 range or something like that. This is a much broader discussion. And and so anyway, but it is, I think in my opinion, this is one of the most important topics and discussions that the church needs to have. It is something that is crucial to a functioning church, society, everything else. And I don't think that we're doing it service by making it overly simplistic. And I also don't think that we're doing it service by just narrowing it down to just being a sex question, because I think it's much broader than that. Anyway, anything else? Any closing remarks? Nope. Okay. Thanks, everyone. I'll stop the recording now.
I love you all.